to another episode of Dying in Grace, the show where we discuss all aspects of end of life, death and dying, and living well. My name is Arlene Stepputat, and I'm delighted to bring a guest each week to discuss some aspect of death and dying. Tonight, we are very lucky to have Dr. Mitch Metzner with us. And Mitch is both a hospice midwife and a writer and an epidemiologist.
For the environment.
For the environment, so that's quite a lot. So Mitch, thank you so much for making the time to come here today. We really appreciate your wisdom.
Thank you, Arlene. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So tell us a little bit about you and how you got involved with death and dying. Just a tad of, how did you get involved in this work?
Like many people, it was kind of by accident. I was working in acute care and gerontology at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. In 1982, I got involved locally in my community in Sacramento, and it sort of drew me in from there. Later, I lost a partner to AIDS in '94, and that really taught me that I wanted to do a lot more of this work when I had the time to do it full-time or volunteer work. It became very important to me then, having witnessed his experience in a hospice. He was the first person I knew who died in a hospice. That really brought me into the work.
Yes, you know, that AIDS epidemic really stoked a lot of us. I think it changed our society in a lot of ways because we hadn't, in modern day, lived through such a plague like that where it was so scary. And at some point, I think it stoked our fear of death just because there was so much unknown, but at the same time, it really rallied us, I think, to care for one another and to go back to what we always knew how to do.
Yeah, I think that's very true. It was very frightening. It didn't seem to have an end in the beginning. And people really realized they weren't able to navigate this alone. It really required people to come together. And we had a little bit of infrastructure already from the 70s and the early hospice movement. And what I found with Chuck's death, it was just so profound and transformative for me. I felt different afterward and really drawn to the work in a way that I wanted more of the profundity, but I also wanted to help people experience a more humane, end-of-life conscious type of experience than many people were experiencing otherwise.
So we share that experience of almost, I would say, befriending death and understanding what a sacred honor it is to be with people in those final moments. But what I think part of your work is about is helping people change that aversion, that denial of death, which is still so pervasive in our culture. And you have some unique points about meaning and perspective. Could you share a little bit with us about your philosophy about how we make meaning in life and how we can make different choices about how we see experiences?
Certainly. I think we've kind of medicalized death much like we did with the birth movement. And there are lessons and opportunities to share as a family with a loved one or to receive as a dying person that alter the final chapter of a person's life in ways that aren't possible in other chapters of life. And sometimes we have these obstacles around denial or inability to receive compassion or care from others that get in the way. And these perspectives and paradigms can be shifted. They're not fixed. They're related to our belief systems, but one person could grow up with a perspective about, an example I use often is the glass half full or half empty. One can meet end of life as an opportunity with unknowns and rich opportunities rather than losing and things being taken away from a person, for example. And it also requires reflecting on one's life and perhaps revisiting some meanings one has ascribed to relationships, to achievements in life. These can be reviewed at the end of life, and it can allow a person a great deal more solace or peace than they would be able to experience if they held on to what they'd been using during their living, doing productive years and sort of denying their mortality.
So part of what you're saying is how we hold any experience, either something that we've done, something that's happened to us, or something that's current, like being diagnosed with a terminal illness, for instance. I think for most people that would be the worst thing that could happen, to be told you have cancer or a brain tumor or something. And yet, what I hear is that I have a choice about how I hold that diagnosis or how I hold those experiences. Could you tell me how can I change my view to go from a half-empty glass to maybe looking a little bit more at the glass being half full with something that seems so traumatic, like a diagnosis?
Well, some of this meaning making is socially conditioned in us. This notion that a terminal disease is only a bad thing. It is traumatic and it is upsetting and it can create a lot of sorrow and sadness in a family. But it's not only that. Many people experience transformation and evolve at the end of their life when they're living with a terminal disease. And there are countless stories and beautiful books that detail these experiences. So I think we can borrow from the experience of other people and try to see what opportunities might be there. Look for gratitude, look for opportunities for coming closer to one's family, maybe healing estrangements in the family that have existed for decades. And this unique little window of time shows up where a person can revisit the meaning they've ascribed to these relationships or events in their life and change the meaning to something that suits them or serves them better.
So I know you've sat at the bedside of many people in your work as a hospice midwife, as it were. Can you tell me a story? You said you have many stories. Can you tell me a story of either a family or an individual that was able to make that transformational change?
Well, I have a number of examples. One that comes to mind is I've done a lot of work with veterans. So I was in a veterans hospital with a retired colonel, someone who'd been very, very stoic, closed off, hid his emotions. You know, was an ideal soldier, for example. Mm-hmm. At the end of life, it was very trying for him to do this experience alone. So in his processing, he realized he wanted more closeness or some compassion that he wasn't accustomed to getting with all the salutes he got instead. So when I would visit him, it was often very difficult to leave his bedside because he would grasp my hand so firmly the entire time I was present. And this is someone who probably had shunned, being touched or hugged or embraced socially before. And every single visit, it was very difficult to remove myself from his bedside because he grasped my hand so tight. There are other stories where I've seen a story of a firefighter who was also very tough and stoic and rugged and had a lot of estrangement from his daughter for his entire life. Didn't want her to come to his bedside. The hospice intervened and encouraged him to maybe revisit that, and they made it possible. The daughter showed up with so much compassion and love that a great deal of healing took place. So that relationship altered from what it had been in a way he didn't know was possible. So the meaning and his perspective on that relationship kind of prevented him from seeing opportunity there.
And it must have taken great courage for him to agree to the hospice to intervene. Because, he could have easily said, no, I don't want my daughter to come.
And that's more common in the early phase of hospice or the early days of dying. But as one gets closer to the end, there is some transformation that happens even if a person isn't doing it consciously or deliberately, as one lets go and sheds our attachment to our career, our name, the environment we're in. And it became easier for him to surrender to this for one reason or another, but it wasn't on his radar initially, but at the end it was a welcomed visit.
These two examples that you give, I think of the roles like soldier or colonel, even the weight of that, and firefighter too, which of course we have, I think here in California, much greater respect for firefighters, but it still summons a particular role and way of being and expectation. So what comes up for me is that there's no vulnerability allowed in those roles. You know,
Yeah.
It's almost like as a leader, you must be strong, you can't be vulnerable. And what I'm hearing you say is in this process, the role gets dropped a bit and the essence of the person comes forward. And you know, you talked about past things being healed and how we once held something, our experience or something, how it can transform. And I'm thinking of how, when you sat with this gentleman, what's the best way for me, or like our audience, who is sitting at the bedside of a family member and really bearing witness to whatever story or end of life review, because it sounds like that's where the transformation can happen, is in looking at the end of my life. What are some ways that people can really hear another person and help them move to that transformation you're talking about?
Well, you mentioned a few really important ones. The bearing witness is a very important way to be fully present for someone without judgment or trying to alter what they're experiencing, not changing the subject, for example. And bearing witness to someone of power or a position, or someone who's been referred to with titles and then now is frequently referred to by caregivers by dearie or sweetie or something. It can be a period of time when a person's losing many things, letting go and surrendering. Sometimes family members aren't capable or aware of the process that's underway and try to subvert that and reassure the dying person that they'll be fine, that they'll go to a movie soon or something. Not telling lies is one way to be supportive, but to have the courage to bear witness to what's occurring for that person, what they're experiencing, and seeing the losses that they're shedding and the opportunities that emerge there. And then staying on topic when they start offering a life review, if they bring up a significant event in their life, asking open-ended questions that facilitate more dialogue rather than closing them off with yes-no conversations or talking about oneself instead, which is sometimes more comfortable.
So when you work with patients, do you also work with the families and coach them into understanding how to listen for some of that? Because I can see it's one thing when you don't have a deep or a history with someone like this colonel you talked about. It sounds like he was someone that you met and worked with at the bedside. I can see for family members wanting to shush dad about that thing that we've never talked about that happened 20 years ago. And I'm wondering, how do you work with the families to open them up a little bit to hear what dad might want to say if he wants to make amends or apologize or just tell a story that's been on his heart?
Well, I have an example that just came to mind too. It's a family member, a loved one of my own, that had a son and also a son-in-law. And in the end, his pain became problematic.
His physical pain?
His physical pain was a little problematic. And in the dying process, people are often tired more easily and fatigued by too much activity, for example. Anyhow, the dying person seemed to shut off both his son and son-in-law and asked them not to come into his room. And I understood that that wasn't a permanent choice he was making, and it didn't represent the relationship they had. So over some days of talking and sharing with them, I was able to help them understand that this wasn't the way they needed to end their relationship, and that ultimately going into his room was more compassionate than trying to honor what they understood to be what he really meant. So trying to take things too literally or using the models and paradigms and perspectives we had while the person was healthy to interpret what they're saying, they don't always apply at the end chapter of life.
You also talk a lot about gratitude and the role that gratitude plays in this process. And I can imagine some people thinking, well, why would I be grateful that someone I love might be dying? And can you speak to where the gratitude is in that process of dying and coming to the end of your life?
Yes, and it's important that a person not think that you can separate them and have only gratitude. Mm-hmm. We naturally experience loss. It's very real and it's deep. Sorting it out, unpacking it, processing it over time, it is easier to do when a person can blend gratitude in there. The gratitude one has for the relationship, the time the two had together, the depth of meaning that was in that relationship, but also the lessons that that relationship experiences because of the disease or the dying process, and the lessons that the dying person is learning. I know this sounds grotesque to some people to hear, but if you can reflect on a time when you've mentored someone, a child or a friend, a loved one, even a peer, mm-hmm. and you've witnessed growth in them, where they experienced something new, an insight occurred, and you witnessed that or were part of it. It's a profound experience to exchange with someone. And during the dying process, if we're able to bear witness and to be fully present to someone's dying, we can be present to help witness some of these events or help facilitate some of their growth, some of their release, some of the peace that they might be able to achieve. And there's room for gratitude and hope in that space on top of the suffering and loss.
So what you're saying is, and I think this is really important, because we can hold all of those emotions at the same time. It's paradoxical. I think we often think we have to be a certain way, and I know this is true in the grieving process. Often, people try to talk people out of their grief because we're uncomfortable, and so this idea that you can hold the whole range of emotions. And I also wondered if you would share a little bit of your own personal experience, because you know death and dying from some of your own personal experiences and being handed some life-threatening experience. I just want people to know we're not just talking theory here, that
yes.
You have lived this in a very real way, and I wondered if you could share about your own process and how you came to some of this viewpoint because of your own transformations.
And that's true. A lot of it was work I had to do for myself to be whole, to heal from loss and suffering and grief, and being dealt a terminal diagnosis when I was 34. I was given 2 years to live, and there was no treatment or cure, and I had to process this notion of limited mortality, and looking fine to all my friends and feeling relatively healthy at the time. And in order to not become bitter and stuck in anger and resentments, frustrations, disappointments, I had to find a way to recast my interpretation of this. And I've done that when I've lost spouses and loved ones, and being at the bedside of the dying has taught me more than anything. I feel like I'm at the feet of a guru every time I'm privileged to be part of that intimate journey. And while it's often traumatic and powerful for me, it's also profound and filled with moments that I later cherish. And being able to cherish those means that it can't all be bad and all suffering. And one becomes more skillful at being able to discern both are occurring at the same time.
Well, when you talk about this, can you remember the moment you got the diagnosis? I mean, what was your first reaction to that? It had to take a while to get to that choice. It sounds like you had anger and upset and shock and all those things one would expect.
Yeah, that's true. Initially, I do remember the moment and being informed and believing that it was impossible. It mm-hmm. couldn't be the case. That process may have taken me a year or more to work through, to actually come to a place where I was grateful for the diagnosis. So I'm not talking just theory, like you said.
Right.
I found a way to be grateful for the way my life changed, that I don't take things for granted the same way.
And in that year, as I understand this, you were still assuming that you were in year one of a year two thing. Mm-hmm. So, part of what you talk about is hope. How was hope in there, like hoping to live or just hoping for lessons? How does hope fit into that choice of perspective?
Hope itself was a little bit harder to get to, but gratitude was easier to access, but also took time. But I was also diagnosed after learning two very valuable lessons, and that was that the meanings I ascribed to events, family events, for example, that I'm not the only person present. My brothers and I recount traumatic or other events very differently, like we were at different places.
Like a different family.
Different families.
Right.
So I learned that the meaning making was really quite arbitrary and that I could alter that to serve me better. And a profound teacher taught me that. And similarly, this idea of perspective, that perspective is a choice I make. I can view the world through lenses that see it very harsh and ugly or hopeful and abundant. And it's not 100% of one and none of the other, and it's not linear. But being able to have these tools has made it possible to see the beauty and the opportunity and the profundity. I find many things more profound when we can stare them in the face rather than turn our head and look away.
So clearly the diagnosis of 2 years was wrong, and so it seems that, as I hear you, that this diagnosis was itself a gift because it did change the way that you look at life. And did it change the trajectory of, did that help you get even more involved in end-of-life work because of your own experience of the diagnosis?
Initially it did, but during a difficult period, I felt I was doing too much of what I was also living. So I backed off a little while. But I've also found that with losses that I've had in life, that I sometimes experience more reflection on the relationship and the gifts that were present in the relationship. And sometimes it alters my ability to put up with the mundane. So, for example, I left some of my science research because I felt there were other things that were more important to me, and I didn't want to be spending my time doing things that felt unimportant or less important than what I could see otherwise. And I think it's my work in dying and confronting terminal disease and working with the dying and the grieving that allows me to make those kinds of choices and extract myself from something that I might have otherwise been trapped, felt obligated to continue on.
And you have some principles about living and dying that you view, like how to hold compassion and just how to approach life. You had some, I know you had something about compassion unlocking something. Anger, is that?
I believe that compassion can unlock anger. And for example, a relationship, a loving relationship that loses compassion can very seldom restore love to the relationship. But I also believe that gratitude is a key for unlocking grief. If we, and many people experience that, if they can find and move through their grief and find the gifts in what they had together or with that loved one, it can also ease the suffering and move the suffering more to a bearable pain than something unbearable. And I think another principle that you might have been alluding to is that I'm very clear I have a mortal body. I'm not confused that this is the only way I can exist and that no matter what, every medical procedure must be done to sustain my body. I don't have that kind of fixed paradigm, and it doesn't plague me when I'm confronted with mortality.
You know, and I think that right there, that is something that we see reflected all the time in our culture, is this denial that the body has an expiration date. You know, we're going to do the wrinkle creams and Botox and, you know, the medical interventions, while many of them are wonderful and important, it's gotten to the point where we're fending off death with every medical intervention that we possibly can, and people do not have graceful exits.
No, we've reached a point where medical technology can sustain a body long after natural death would have occurred, years. And we've begun to dance with this question of the ethics and morality of doing that to someone whose natural course in life is to die. And to move through a disease process that gets somehow forestalled with extreme medical measures and more procedures. And frankly, there are times when costs are inappropriate, where another person could benefit from the funds that would go to that person's treatment. And this other person might be able to survive and live out many more years, while someone with a clearly terminal state cannot benefit from the extreme measures that are often brought forward to extend their life when there really is no hope for them to exist in any form of a dignified way.
So, Mitch, in your work, and you've traveled extensively, I know you've gone to other cultures and looked at how they hold death. Do you think that we, as an American society, are starting to wake up a little bit about how we hold death, or do you think we're still locked in?
I think there's both. There's some evolving consciousness in many fields of life, child rearing and healthy eating and fitness. I think some of our awareness about death being natural and that it can be done more at home and doesn't need to be medicalized, that it's a normal process. The body's wired to do it. Our DNA knows how to shut down the body, just as a woman's body knows how to give birth. I think if we see more of that kind of evolving and a restoration of some care in the home like it used to be. Up to the Civil War, it was very common for our culture for people to witness the full cycle of life often. Then it became medicalized, and nursing funeral parlors and things took over something that used to be normal and done at home.
Well, Mitch, you have offered us such a wonderful perspective, and is there a final message you just in a sentence like to offer about how we should hold death?
Oh, thank you. There is actually, I believe that the last chapter of life is full of opportunity for transformation and for healing all the injuries that might have accumulated in a person's life. Perhaps not all of them, but many. And I wish for our culture that more of us can see these opportunities and not just the loss.
Well, we'll have to end it there. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank you, the viewer, for watching. I'd like to thank TVSB for allowing us to broadcast. I'd like to thank my crew, Elliot Jacobson and Michael Nicholson.